This morning we're continuing our series through 1 Peter. And the topic this morning is being confident in the world. And what I want to start thinking about is what it means to be living as a Christian in the world in 2022. And it's a topic, isn't it, that's become even more relevant given the events that have happened in Ukraine this week. The reading that Annie read to us this morning starts actually a couple of verses back from the sect reading, if you've been following the book. Because what I want us to think about is the link between being confident in our identity and being confident in the world. The writer goes from saying that we are a royal priesthood, a holy people, to saying we're aliens, strangers. And if we're to live as Christians in the 21st century, we need to understand what it is to be both a royal priesthood and strangers in this land. And as we start to understand that, we start to understand something of what it is that's our mission as Christians, but also some of the challenges that by that very nature brings us into. There's a saying, isn't there, that we should keep religion out of politics and politics out of religion. But there's problems with that, isn't there? One of them is it tends to be people who don't like their political views changed or challenged by people of faith. But the other one is, I'm not sure that's actually how God sees the world. Religion, politics, however we want to define them, are intricately bound together. It's all about people and people's lives. If we look at the Old Testament, we can see how God was involved in both the religious and the politics of the people of Israel. If we read things like the book of Exodus and Moses, God gives Moses the 10 Commandments, instructions about worship, building the tabernacle, but also how to run a secular state, how to impose laws. The religious and the secular laws are intertwined in what God said to Moses. We come to things like the Exodus, a major political intervention, God intervening in the nation of Egypt. And the Exodus would have left Egypt with significant political and social repercussions. We move forward. We think about how Joshua led the Israelites over the Jordan and into Canaan and took Canaan by force. The destruction of Jericho was a political and military exercise with huge loss of life. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, we see God influencing kings, rulers and nations. God's portrayed as being actively involved in national and international politics. We see God making specific interventions for particular purposes. But equally what we don't see is we don't see God micromanaging every event in international politics. There's still free will out there. And if we think, during the period of things like the kings and judges, Israel functioned as a theocracy. The rulers were appointed by God, and the religious life and the laws were all interwoven. They were all one. But if we move forward and into the New Testament, we see a slightly different perspective, don't we? Here we see the people of Israel living under Roman rule. And the Romans have a very different belief system and a very different basis for laws. And we see the tensions start to be played out when Jesus is asked about paying taxes to Caesar. He says, give to Caesar what Caesar's and to God what is God. And here we start to see that split between the secular and religious life, because the nature of the state has changed from the nation of Israel to living under the Roman Empire. So in this letter of 1 Peter, we see this starting to be worked out in more detail. In verse 9 we're told, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. And then 2 sentences later, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world. And it's that dichotomy, isn't it, that the early Christians lived with and that we have to live with in Britain today. We are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, but we're also aliens and strangers, aren't we, in this land that we live in. To put it another way, we are in this world but not of it. We live in this world but are different from it. And that leads us into some challenging places. One of the implications that Peter draws out of this passage is that if God is sovereign over the rules of the nations, then we should submit to the rulers. And I think that probably causes a lot of us to take a deep breath, particularly considering the events that have happened this week in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world at the moment. What does it mean to us as Christians in Britain? What does it mean to us, for our brethren, our fellow Christians living in Russia and the Ukraine? How do they respond to these sorts of passages? The passage also throws up other challenges. Things like, how does slavery fit into the Bible? In the Old Testament, particularly in the time of the patriarchs, slaves were part of the cultural norm. Some of the great biblical characters had slaves and concubines. And in the Roman Empire, at the time of Jesus, a lot of estimates will say that over 50% of the population were slaves. But it wasn't something that Jesus actively challenged. And here in this passage from Peter, slaves are being told to obey their masters, even the bad ones. So does this mean we should ignore what's going on in the world? Bury our heads in the sand? Just leave it up to God and hope he sorts it all out? No, I don't think that's where the writer's going with his argument. I think it's the opposite. He is expecting believers to do something. After all, it was Christians that were at the forefront of banning the slave trade in the 19th century. In verse 12, the writer says this, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. And then in verses 15 and 16, for it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God and show proper respect to everyone. This isn't a call to do nothing. It's a call to live lives that are so holy that the world can do nothing less than but take notice of us and be influenced by what we say and what we do. Paul echoes this in his call for holy living. And it's built on Jesus' teaching. If we think back particularly to things like the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. The challenge we have is how do we live out being a chosen people, a royal priesthood, while living as aliens and strangers in the land. And we need to go back to the last session in this series to be reminded of who we are and have confidence in our identity, that we are chosen by God. We are a child of God. And that's a truth that cannot be changed. And once we have that confidence in our identity, we can go into the world and be confident to live the life in the world that God's calling us to do. In the Gospels, we have recorded the teachings of Jesus as he explains how we're to live, what our attitudes and actions should be. And all of those teachings are quite clear. So it should be simple to live out a Christian life. But of course, we know that it's not that simple, is it? Not everything is always so black and white. How do we respect everyone when some of those people hold views that are diametrically opposed to what we believe are God's laws and God's teaching? And that's becoming increasingly one of the challenges that we have as we live as Christians in the world today. It's likely that most of us here in Britain see the problems in Ukraine as being mainly caused by the threat of Russian expansionism. But what about the views of our brothers and sisters sitting in an equivalent church in Russia this morning? Maybe some of them would see the problem as Russia having to defend itself against Western and NATO expansionism. And our brothers and sisters in Ukraine who are caught up in the middle of a fight that's not theirs. Well, what about something that the church in this country has been wrestling with for years? How do we encompass the LGBTQ community with a lifestyle that's not in keeping with what we see as biblical laws, but at the same time we're called to show proper respect to everyone? How do we resolve these seemingly incompatible demands on us as Christians? And there are two incidents in Jesus' ministry that I think bear thinking about in this context. One is the incident that we saw earlier about paying taxes to Caesar. One of the implications of this is that we should obey the laws of the land. But Jesus very deliberately didn't pick a political fight with the Roman authorities. But what he did do was to show people God's way of doing things. What we would call today perhaps the battle for people's hearts and minds. And linked to that is the incident of the woman caught in adultery and how Jesus responded to that. The mob wanted to stone the woman, which in a sense was a legitimate response, because that was the punishment for adultery in the law that God had given. That law was given by God, and Jesus didn't change it. What he did do was say, yes, the woman had broken the law, but if anybody wanted to judge her and punish her, then they couldn't have broken any laws themselves. But what's also significant is that Jesus was without sin, so he could have thrown that first stone, but he didn't. And that is God's grace in action, isn't it? That is the difference. Surely that's an example of what Peter's saying when it says, live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds. They tried to catch Jesus out, but no one had a comeback to him because of how good a life he was leading. There's an old African proverb that goes something like, how do you eat an elephant? The answer being one mouthful at a time. And in many ways what we're seeing here is how do we change the world? And we change it one person at a time. If we are living such good lives that people notice those lives and actions. And the sort of church growth surveys show that people come to faith by having conversations with Christians, and they've had that conversation with a Christian because they've seen a life that's attractive and is different. They see people living those good lives. The early church that Peter was writing to was persecuted for its faith, was persecuted for living out good lives. And he warns them that they will suffer the consequences of doing good. Today we live in an increasingly secular and in some ways increasingly intolerant society. And it's becoming harder for us, isn't it, to live out those good lives, those lives that God wants us to do according to his laws. This means that it's also true that we may well suffer as a consequence of living out those lives that reflect that we are a royal priesthood, people chosen by God in a land where we're aliens and strangers because of our faith. The Bible tells us that world peace is only going to come after the second coming, after Jesus comes to judge the world. Before then, there will be persecution, war, rumours of war. This shouldn't be a surprise to us. But the writer does leave his readers with hope. He says, "But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins on his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed." We're not asked to do anything that Jesus hasn't already done. Jesus suffered although he had done no wrong. The promise of the gospel is that God will judge us all with righteousness and justice, and we will be commended for our good deeds. God's calling us to live holy lives according to God's laws. If we do that, there will be consequences, opposition, and maybe persecution. If we are to live as a royal priesthood and a holy nation, whilst being aliens and strangers in this country, then there will be a cost. These things happened to Jesus, and he said it would happen to his followers. But if we want to, and if we are going to change our nation and our world, it's a risk that we've got to take. Because first and foremost, we're a people of God who need to follow that calling as being aliens and strangers whilst being a royal priesthood. Amen.